Hello, this is Aaron Mean of SG Gaming Info, and welcome to my video review of Idea Factory International's Megadimension Neptunia V2. Neptunia V2 is the latest main series Neptunia title, and sequel to Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory. And after playing Megadimension Neptunia V2 for over 37 hours, I can easily say it is the best game in the franchise. Neptunia V2 offers the best storytelling in the franchise to date and a raft of gameplay changes that are both good and mildly frustrating. For those unaware, the Neptunia franchise is a relatively niche JRPG franchise that takes the video game industry and puts a JRPG spin on it. In the franchise and in this game there are four main characters called CPUs. These characters are humanoid versions of consoles. This means the four main characters, Neptune, Vert, Noir and Blanc, all represent a console. Neptune is Sega, that is if Sega still made consoles. Vert is Microsoft's Xbox, Noir is PlayStation and Blanc is Nintendo. The nations in the world are built around each company's ideals, so for example, Blanc's nation of Louis is very childlike and Vert's nation of Leanbox is a look towards a more soldier and military focused lifestyle. References don't stop with the CPUs. All playable characters represent a platform, game, developer, publisher, or section of the video game industry. The franchise for all intents and purposes is a satire of the game industry. This is made even clearer when the enemies have turned out to be piracy or hacking cards. The satire also leads to fourth wall breaking moments and even comments about the current state of the games industry. So enough of the basic introduction, let's talk about Neptunia V2. In terms of storytelling, Neptunia V2 contains three stories: Zero Dimension Neptunia Z, Hyperdimension Neptunia G, and Heart Dimension Neptunia H. Each one of these stories could easily work as their own game, but Neptunia V2 puts them together to create an amazing overarching storyline that will leave you shocked, happy and sad. I'll try not to spoil anything important, but here is a breakdown of the game's story and my overall impression. Zero Dimension Neptunia Z story focuses on an old abandoned console Neptune finds in Planetune. This old console has a striking resemblance to the Sega Dreamcast as it is white and has a spiral on it. Upon bringing this console home, both Neptune and Nepgear are transported to another dimension, the Zero Dimension. In this dimension, game industry is in ruin, as a giant CPU reigns terror on this dimension. In the dimension, Neptune and Nepgear team up with the Zero Dimension's only CPU, Uzume, and her friend Umio, who is a fish with a man's face. While in this dimension, they learn R4 is involved in the story. For those unfamiliar, R4 was an antagonist in all previous main series games. Zero Dimension's story is a change of pace for the franchise, as Neptunia games always have a light side to them, but Zero Dimension has a lot of dark and mysterious undertones that in many ways surprised me. Zero Dimension's dark and mysterious tone is a tone that is carried into the game's second story, Hyperdimension Neptunia G. Hyperdimension Neptunia G's story takes place shortly after Zero Dimension and is set in what you could describe as the Prime Dimension. This story focuses on the CPU shift period, a time where residents of game industry look for a new CPU to follow. And just like in real world, there's a lot of half-truth and slanders being thrown around as people select their CPUs. And so to stop this, the CPUs create a multi-nation festival. The festival is a success until a group known as Gold Third show up. Gold Third is made up of four members: K-Sha, C-Sha, B-Sha and S-Sha. These members fight the CPUs and easily defeat them. But defeating the CPUs causes the world to suddenly change. This change involves the CPUs being forgotten and the members of the Gold Third becoming the new rulers of the four nations of game industry. In Hyperdimension Neptunia G, the four CPUs have to track down each member of Gold Third and learn how their fight changed the entire dimension. Find out who created all the false and hateful rumours about the CPUs, and most importantly, find out why a mysterious figure is trying to alter events to fit her desire. Hyperdimension Neptunia G is the most interesting of the three stories, as the story is divided into three parts. 1. The world before it changes. 2. Each CPU getting their own individual character arcs. And 3. The rejoining of all the CPUs and characters to fight the big bad. The splitting of CPUs into 4 different character arcs was something I wasn't initially happy about, as I felt it existed just to pad out the game. But the 4 CPU arcs create some powerful backstory for the CPUs, CPU candidates, and Gold Third. The arcs also show just how each nation would exist without a CPU or proper ruler. And honestly, just like Zero Dimension's story, it makes for some dark tones. In the arcs, we see a harsh dystopian society where people's lives are determined at birth, executions, disregard for life, and war. Hyperdimension Neptunia G's tone does shift from character arc to character arc, but the overall tone of uneasiness exists in all of them. The overall tone can be best seen in the story's boss, General Afimojas, leader of Afimax, as he doesn't care about what's happening to the world as long as he's making money. With Afimojas, we see how insane greed changed the world, but like all Neptunia games, there is a silly side to his money-grubbing actions. Hyperdimension Neptunia G also introduces players to the next level of HDD mode, Next Form. And now we move on to the final story, Heart Dimension Neptunia H Trilogy Finale. This story ties everything together, because before this story there's no clear reason on how the first and second stories are connected, apart from the Sega Dreamcast. As far as story finales go, Heart Dimension Neptunia H is very interesting, and it's really what made me love the game's overall story. Heart Dimension Neptunia H explains everything to its players. For example, we learn what Gold Third is, who Izumi is, why are we hopping between 3 different dimensions, etc. While I don't want to say too much due to not wanting to spoil the game, Heart Dimension Neptunia H is a fantastic conclusion that answers nearly every single question I had about the game. Heart Dimension Neptunia H also offers what I feel is one of the saddest normal route endings in a Neptunia game to date. So when you look at all 3 stories as a whole, Megadimension Neptunia V2 is an amazing rush that does a decent job of not burning itself out by managing its high and low points extremely well. And of course, like all Neptunia games, the overall story centers on one aspect of video game culture. In Megadimension Neptunia V2, it's most definitely the greed of both developers and fans. Since I focused on talking about the story, let's talk about the game's characters. If you've played the previous Neptunia games, the CPU and CPU candidates are mostly unchanged. However, the single character arcs do provide some additional character development. The new characters, i.e. Izumi, Gold Third, and the villains Afimojas and Steamax are all well developed. For being the 2 main villains in the second story, Afimojas and Steamax are very relaxed and nerdy characters, a fact that is both annoying and heartwarming. Keisha, Bisha, Sisha, and Esha of Gold Third are an interesting cast, as they are the representation of 4 real-world game developers: Konami, Bandai Namco, Capcom, and Square Enix. This representation is played out well, as each character has personalities that you might attribute to the company they represent. This also makes for some hilarious moments, especially when you realise that the controlling / yandere style character of Keisha represents Konami. Finally, we have Izumi, whose character is difficult to talk about without ruining important parts of the game. While I can't say much, I will say she does have a personality shift when transforming, but this isn't overbearing like Plutia was from Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory. Izumi is basically a character that is trying to be happy and composed in a dimension that has torn itself and her apart. If you're wondering about side characters from the previous Neptunia games, I'm afraid I have some bad news, as characters such as Gust or Red are not in this game. Now let's talk about an important aspect of the Neptunia games: humour. While I did say Neptunia V2 is darker than previous titles, it keeps the franchise's trademark humour. which for those who don't know includes fourth wall breaking, video game jokes, and of course jokes about characters, proportions and personalities. Personally, the best aspect of Neptunia II's humour comes from Vert's character arc. The humour in this arc stems from the Gold Third member Esha, who is the representation of Square Enix. At one point in the arc, she says that she almost died making a film, but was saved. This line and subsequent lines refer to the fact that Squaresoft almost went out of business because of the movie Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, and how Enix saved them. While the humour can be very much in your face, there is one bad aspect that exists along with the humour: fan service. Yes, Neptunia V2 contains numerous pieces of fan service, which goes from jokes about the size of a character's breasts to a bat scene. While I don't mind fan service, it is off-putting when you realise that some of the more risky scenes depict young-looking characters. Before going on to talking about gameplay and combat in Megadimension Neptunia V2, I have to mention that story and character development takes up the vast majority of the game. How much are you asking? Well, it takes about 20 minutes to get to your first piece of actual gameplay, as these 20 minutes are taken up by a lot of reading and listening to dialogue. I think it's time to move on to the gameplay. Gameplay in Neptunia V2 has received some changes and enhancements. Two of the most noticeable new features are investment and road building. Investment involves donating money to improve the commercial, industrial and public relations of each individual nation. Leveling up each section offers new items in shops, additional development items and special events. The road building feature is a brand new way to travel from dungeon to dungeon on the world map. Road building is essentially creating a path connecting a nation to a dungeon. While road building is an interesting idea, it is annoying. The reason why it's annoying is because you have to spend credits to create a route, and while you are travelling along these routes, random encounters can occur, which can be incredibly annoying, as travelling from, say, nation to nation can involve a near constant barrage of encounters, and for me, barraging a player with random encounters isn't fun. Personally, I enjoyed the old world map travelling solution of clicking on a location and going directly to it without interruption. Apart from road building and investment, changes have been made to several existing gameplay features. The plans feature has been altered and turned into development. Stella's dungeon has been changed to scouts. The scout feature now allows you to send scouts to a dungeon to look for items, hidden items, find new monsters and scouts, etc. Also, while a scout is in a dungeon, the dungeon is altered. So this means when you're in a dungeon you might gain extra experience or fight against more powerful monsters. Before I forget, there is also two other gameplay changes. These are changes to conversations and the share system. With conversations, there is one major change, and that is that not all conversations involve 2D models talking directly to you in a visual novel style. Some conversations now occur during 3D in-game cutscenes. Regarding share changes, it isn't anything major, it is just that shares now affect the gameplay instead of just the story. The level of share energy a nation has can now alter the CPU's power in combat. The main way this alteration occurs is the CPU with the most shares does extra damage. Now, I think it's time to talk about combat. Combat in Neptunia V2 has gone through a number of alterations, with the inclusion of formation skills, break parts, multiple health bar for bosses, and giant battles. In terms of changes, the combo system has been given an overhaul, and attachments have changed from providing stats to being pure cosmetic pieces. First of all, let's look at the new features, all of which are pretty simple. Formation skills involves moving characters to a certain position and attacking together. Break parts is a change to the guard break system from previous Neptunia titles. Break parts is essentially attempting to break a piece of a monster's equipment to do extra damage. Giant battles and multiple health bars are two massive changes. At certain points in the game you'll fight giant enemies and you can only fight them using SP and EXE skills. And as for multiple health bars for bosses, it is simply a way to make bosses different and appear more powerful. So I talked about what's new, but what has changed? Well, as I mentioned, the biggest change is to the combo system. On the surface, it is identical to previous Neptunia titles, but there is a large tweak. And this tweak is that the amount of combos you can perform is tied to the weapon you are using. For example, Neptune's Beam Katana V allows her to perform 3 attacks, with a choice of 2 rush, 2 power, or 2 standard attacks. But in comparison, her Claymore, which allows her to perform 3 attacks, alters her choice of attacks. Because with the Claymore she only has a choice of 1 rush, 2 power, or 2 standard. It isn't a change that's immediately noticeable, but it does offer a way to change your style and to use more attack types, as some of these do combo together. Another combat change is to the HDD mode. The HDD mode no longer uses SP, but instead uses your EXE drive. It now takes 1 EXE bar to transform. While this change slows down the transformation process, it frees up some valuable SP. The changes to combat makes for an overall new experience, but this new experience has one small issue. You can no longer make fine adjustments to your directional attacks with the directional pad. Now, before reaching my conclusion, I want to touch on the game's graphics, sound, and music. Graphically, Neptunia V2 is the best looking Neptune game to date, with both 2D and 3D models receiving huge makeovers in terms of polish and overall appearance. The level of polish and overall graphical improvement can also be seen with the scenery and monsters. When it comes to sound, the voice acting is still great, but the repetitive and annoying dialogue in dungeons still unfortunately exist. Honestly, I feel the Neptunia series has done a great job with the English voice work. And finally, I want to touch on the game's music, which I can only describe as fantastic. From the first dungeon to transformation sequences, the music is spot on. So, in conclusion, Megadimension Neptunia V2 is by far the best Neptunia game to date. The game has a massive 3-part story that offers some surprisingly dark moments and a cast of humorous and interesting characters. However, the game suffers from some poor and annoying gameplay changes. And with that all said, I give Megadimension Neptunia V2 a score of 8 out of 10, with the game's pros being a massive 3-part story, interesting characters, fourth wall breaking, and video game reference humour, and the music. The game's cons are several sexualized scenes, can be confusing for those who aren't fans of the series, and some gameplay alterations such as road building are disappointing. Thank you for watching. Please like, favourite and subscribe. For more gaming information, please visit sggaminginfo.com, and don't forget to like our Facebook page at facebook.com/sggaminginfo, and follow us on Twitter at sggaminginfo.